Hi there, folks. We are doing our supplemental discussion right now for the Slate Political Gabfest. I know they're not doing the usual format. They've got only two segments this time rather than three, but I think there's a lot to break into here. And there's a lot that they just kind of mentioned in passing they might not be familiar with. So to contextualize that, let's get into it. So one thing they mentioned that they don't talk much about is the use of the Defense Production Act. So the Defense Production Act, this is a Korean War era law, so 1950s, that allows the U.S. government to basically take over manufacturers, to tell manufacturers to make manufacturers produce certain things. So this law is most well known for leading to a famous Supreme Court decision, Youngstown v. Sawyer. So Youngstown v. Sawyer, during the Korean War, President Truman sought to take over production of steel mills, essentially trying to shut down some labor disputes that were going on in steel mills and force the steel mills to keep on producing steel for the war effort. The Supreme Court shut them down and basically said, you can't do this because we already have a way for you, the government, to take over mills, and this is the Defense Production Act. So under the Defense Production Act, the president, basically there's no congressional oversight required here, the president is allowed to force factories to produce things for a war effort or for a national emergency. This is, again, mostly used or been discussed using it for actual war efforts. We need more tanks, so we're ordering you to take your car factory and start building tanks. And, of course, you're still paid for it, so the factory would still be paid no amount. In fact, it's argued this actually incentivizes these factories to do it because they have to do it and they have guaranteed paycheck from the government for having done so. So the Defense Production Act right now is relatively controversial because President Trump last week had said he was using the Defense Production Act. He had required, and he was using it to speed production of masks and of ventilators. These are two things that we really need, what's called PPE, or personal protective equipment, for physicians. So the N95 masks, these are the special masks that physicians use that keep out most of the particulates. So a lot of the masks you guys see are paper masks, and those are relatively useful, or cloth masks, relatively useful, but a lot of stuff can still spread through them. So those paper masks or cloth masks seem to be mostly useful for individual people who might be asymptomatic, to have that on to mostly keep their germs in. The sort of mask the physicians mostly use are N95 masks, and these are masks with a little respirator over here on the side. And those don't have enough of them. Part of that is because they're mostly produced in China, and China's been using a lot of them for obvious reasons. The other part of that is that we had large tariffs on them. So we were in the middle of a trade war with China for the past couple of years. And as a result, the N95 masks were under tariff, were part of that trade war, and as a result, they simply were not being imported. So the Defense Production Act would allow the president to order factories that could make these N95 masks or could make ventilators. These are the machines that are helping people breathe. But a lot of what COVID-19 does, it gets into your lungs, makes it very hard to breathe, so we need more ventilators. There's basically air pumps to basically breathe for you. And we have a lot of factories that could be pretty easily retrofitted to make those things. So General Motors and Ford have both talked about they could start making ventilators if they want to. It would just take them a couple months to switch over production. So last week, President Trump had said that he was invoking the Defense Production Act and was going to use it to make more ventilators and make more masks. There's some confusion about this because we couldn't find the paperwork where it was actually done. And then afterwards, President Trump came out and said, "Oh, no, I said that, but I didn't actually do it." So his claim apparently is that because he can threaten factories with the Defense Production Act, saying, if you don't make the stuff I want you to make, I will force you to make it, that's using the Defense Production Act, but without actually invoking the Defense Production Act. And he has since said that it would be a bad idea to use the Defense Production Act because the government shouldn't take over factories. This has caused a lot of controversy. We have a lot of governors, especially in New York, Andrew Cuomo, who's been saying, look, we need the Defense Production Act. That as a state, New York and New Jersey, I can't force companies to make masks or to make ventilators, but we need them. And so if the federal government steps in, they can force General Motors or Ford or whoever to step in and make these masks, and make the masks and, of course, make the ventilators. And the president has said he doesn't want to do that. And this seems to be a result of a lot of lobbying on the part of large companies. The companies don't want to be forced to make this stuff. They're worried it will not be very profitable for them. And so they've been lobbying the president, say, hey, look, we'll do this stuff for you. Just don't force us to do it. And the president so far has gone along with it. This actually leads into a pretty disturbing news report from yesterday, I think came out after the podcast had dropped, where General Motors said, all right, we'll make you ventilators but we want $1 billion to make all these ventilators. And the president said, no, that's too much money. We don't want them. Alejandro's asking, why is the company not making the masks and selling them? The answer is companies do want to make the masks. The N95 mask, the problem is, though, you can't just start making them overnight. It requires certain materials. It requires a whole factory set up to make them. So if you start making them today, say, we're going to retrofit your factory to actually make them, it's going to take you 2 months to build your factory. And then after you build your factory, then you can source all those materials. Remember, most of these companies have international supply chains. They're getting supplies from all over the world, plastics and all these things from all over the world. So once they build the factory, it's going to take months and cost them hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. Then they have to bring in all the materials to actually make the masks. Well, they're not going to do that unless they are guaranteed they're going to make some money off of it. Because let's say they do it in 4 months, they start producing that N95 mask, and everyone goes, no, we're good. Don't worry about it. We're fine. Now, I think that's probably a little optimistic. In 4 months, we're certainly going to need some more N95 masks, but companies aren't willing to take that risk. So this is actually why the Defense Production Act is thought to be important, because it would force companies, right? Say, look, you're going to do this. We're going to buy them. So there's no risk for you. And as a company, you now are required to make these masks. You're going to do it, whether you want to or not. They also take some of the pressure off the shareholders, right? The CEO doesn't want to go to shareholders and say, we're not making cars, we're making masks because we think it's good for us. But the CEO can go to shareholders and say, we're making the masks because the federal government requires us to do it. Not his fault anymore. So we're not being used for the Defense Production Act has not actually been invoked, is not being used. The president said he doesn't want to use it and said it would be socialism. I said it would be like you should ask people in Venezuela what happens if the government takes over factories. That's a rather ridiculous thing to say. Venezuela had a command economy where the government was taking over everything. And I don't think there's anyone who's seriously arguing that's a bad idea for the government to force production of essential goods in a wartime footing. And again, the big deal here is that it basically guarantees that there's a market for them, that there guarantees that the factories will be able to sell it, which encourages them to actually do it, whether you force them or not. All right, let's also break down this bailout bill. So the bailout bill is being argued over in the House of Representatives right now. There's not really a serious argument. There's no one who's saying it's a bad idea or against it. The people who are against it, for the most part, are objecting to the enormous amount of money that's going to large corporations in the bailout bill. And right now, we're actually in a bit of drama on the House floor, like literally as we're speaking, because there are not a lot of people on the House floor. So most members of the House have gone back to their districts in order to avoid being in Washington, D.C., which is having a big outbreak, in order to avoid, do social distancing and stay away from everyone. And this is a problem because the House of Representatives requires a quorum to function. So you have to have a majority of members of the House of Representatives actually on the floor of the House of Representatives to function. There is no way under current rules to actually do remote voting, which at this point seems like a pretty big problem. So we don't have any remote voting. And so as a result, you need to actually have 218 people on the floor if someone calls for a quorum. So basically, if there aren't 218 people on the floor, and there aren't, so if there probably aren't 200 members of the House that are actually in Washington right now. So if there aren't enough people on the floor, that's fine. You can still do business. But if one member of the House, literally one guy, asks for a quorum call, says, hey, I don't think we have enough people here to vote, then you actually have to take roll and you have to bring in a majority of members. Otherwise, the House can't do any business. So we were expecting that no one would actually be a big enough asshole to force a quorum call and bring everyone back into their offices and see if we can get 218 people on the House floor. But we, in fact, did find one asshole. A guy's name is Thomas Massey, a representative from Massachusetts, who is forcing a quorum call, forcing everyone back. And that's going to be a problem. So first off, it'll delay the passage of this bill in the House of Representatives, and it'll expose a bunch of people to COVID-19 potentially. There's already 2 members of the House of Representatives who have tested positive. I think there's now 5 members of the Senate who are in quarantine or have tested positive. So it's a bad idea. The guy's a jerk, but what are you going to do? Okay, so let's talk about what's actually in this bill, because despite Mr. Massey's theatrics, it will certainly pass 96-0 in the Senate. That'll pass by a pretty wide margin in the House of Representatives as well. So what's in there? What's good? What's bad? The big thing that people are talking about is direct payments. So direct payments, this is about $1,200, $2,400 per person, per family rather. So basically $1,200 per person, per worker in a family, for a total of $2,400, plus an extra $500 per kid. So if you were a working family of 2 with 1 child, you could expect to get a check for $2,900 from the government to try and help tide you over during this period. Now, this is not for everybody. This actually phases out higher levels of income. So if your individual income is $75,000 or more, or your family income is $150,000 or more, you're going to get less. And if your individual income is $100,000 or your family's income is $200,000, you don't get anything at all, not even the $500 per kid. So this is designed to help workers who don't have a lot of money to start with. So even workers with very low levels of income, think if you're not making a lot of money, $1,200 in your pocket is pretty good. The idea here is to try and give people a little extra money just to tide them over, help them pay their rent, things like that. It's in the global comparison, actually not very much. So even in Canada, so neighbors to the north, they're actually giving $2,000 Canadian per person. So it's not quite $2,000 American, but $2,000 per person per month. Whereas in theory, the direct payment we're getting out of the federal government right now is actually a one-time payment. It's expected they'll probably pass another bill later to have more payments, but the Canadians, other countries are giving a lot more money, giving it on a monthly basis rather than giving it as a one-time payment. Something that might be of interest perhaps to you is right now they're also doing suspension of student loan payments. So remember, almost all student loans in the United States are backstopped by the federal government, and the federal government is saying, all right, look, you're cool. If you don't want to pay your student loans right now, you don't have to. You just have to call the student loan servicer and say, it's weird, they have like a magic word sort of thing. We have to say, I am not able to make my payments because of COVID-19, and then you don't have to pay. That's for, I think, at least 6 months at this point. Boost unemployment benefits. So this is another thing that's being a lot of money on an individual basis, is that if you're unemployed because of COVID-19 or just in general, we're boosting unemployment benefits. So unemployment is normally paid for by the state. So in your taxes, you'll see when you get your paycheck from your employer, if you've got one, it'll have a line up that says NJUI, that's New Jersey Unemployment Insurance. And so unemployment insurance is run by the states and typically gives people unemployed by no fault of their own. So if you behave badly and get out of money relative to your previous income. So the more money you're making before, the bigger unemployment benefits are going to be. So New Jersey is relatively nice, gives out quite a bit of money in unemployment. Other states are not. So if we were in Alabama, I was picking Alabama, but it's only because they're bad. Your maximum weekly unemployment check is going to be, I think, $250 or so. This is the most anyone can get. So it's not very much. So what the federal government has done is saying, look, we want to increase the amount that goes into student loan payments. I'm sorry, not student loan, into the unemployment benefits. And so the federal government is going to pay for everyone to get basically their entire paycheck through unemployment. So if you're laid off, you're still going to get your entire paycheck, which you would have gotten before. And actually, oftentimes get extra above the maximum that your state is actually going to allow. This became controversial a few days ago in the Senate because it means that for some workers who are paid very poorly, they actually might be making more money on unemployment for a short period of time than they would if they were working. And you had some senators saying, well, Republican senators saying, this is bad because it means nurses are going to quit their job in order to collect unemployment because they'll be making more money on unemployment than they would as nurses. So is this really a possibility? Well, it is true that some people may make more money on unemployment than they did if they were working. I would argue that's probably an indictment of how low our wages are in general, that your wages are that low that the $1,200 or a month you're going to make on unemployment is actually more than you would have made by working. So that's bad. But also, I think we need to remember, and these senators didn't seem to really understand how unemployment works. That is, you can't just quit your job and collect unemployment. You don't get unemployment if you quit your job. You only get unemployment if you are fired or laid off. And again, if you're fired because you did something wrong, you don't get unemployment there either. So, the idea that a nurse is going to quit their job to collect unemployment is wrong for a couple reasons. First off, most nurses are working harder than ever. Second off, most nurses make way more than the amount of money you're going to get off of unemployment. And third, you can't quit and collect unemployment anyway. So some of this is controversial because this is because Republican senators starting to hold the bill over it. Eventually, they did not, but it was something controversial at the time. All right. Also, we are allowing the federal bill in terms of unemployment benefits and the direct payments are allowing gig economy workers. So people who drive for Uber or Lyft or people who are doing deliveries who have been laid off. It's allowing them to actually collect some of the benefits as well. That's something that's never really been allowed before. So we're changing the rules here a little bit to let gig economy workers do it. The centerpiece of this bill, though, and where most of the money is going, is to a giant lending program. So it's a $500 billion lending program that goes out to mostly large corporations, assuming that they don't do layoffs. So it says, okay, you can get a loan from the government. And if you agree to keep on paying your employees, 90% of your employees, if you agree to keep on doing that, then you don't have to pay the loan back. It basically becomes a grant. If you lay off people, now it's a loan. And this provision is largely as necessary because there are so many businesses large businesses that have been hurt by this. Airlines, anyone running amusement parks, anyone running restaurants, all sorts of big companies that are really in trouble because of this are going to apply for these grants. They're going to come in. And it's $500 billion. Now, in the original version of the bill, this was going to be given out by the Treasury Secretary. Basically, the Trump administration proposal was the Treasury Secretary, a guy named Steve Mnuchin. We'll just give these out to whoever we wanted, and there'll be no oversight. So Congress wouldn't be able to approve or disapprove. And indeed, they wouldn't have to tell you who got those loans, who got those grants from the government until 6 months later. So essentially after the election. And that was a non-starter for a lot of Democrats who pushed back very hard against this, saying, first off, it shouldn't be just up to Mnuchin. If we're giving $500 billion, there should be some strings attached. And that strings attached to things like you're not supposed to be doing layoffs, you can't give dividends, you have to limit your pay for your executives, things like that. So Democrats pushed for and won those sort of provisions in the bill. In addition, they also got the oversight. So the oversight being Congress is going to see who's getting the money and who's not getting the money, rather than just have Steve Mnuchin decide on his own and not tell anybody for 6 months. Also, another provision that was inserted that Mnuchin fought very hard against, the Trump administration fought very hard against, was say that none of the money can go to elected officials or their relatives. A lot of the Democrats saying, look, if we just give Steve Mnuchin $500 billion, he's going to give that to President Trump and President Trump's properties. Now, of course, President Trump's properties have been hurt by the coronavirus, right? All hotels have been. So he could say, well, my hotels and resorts needed that money, so I took $1 billion or $5 billion. And of course, nobody wanted that. Democrats especially said, that's really looks like corruption in such an important bill. So they put a stop to that and said, if you basically, no person in the government or their immediate relatives can get money through this program. So the $500 billion, there's some oversight. We don't know if it'll be enough oversight. The podcast talked about the question of how much oversight is actually good in a case like this. But I think we can certainly agree that some oversight, somebody saying who gets the money and who doesn't, is always better than having absolutely no oversight and just letting Steve Mnuchin do whatever the hell he wants with it. There are strings that were attached are not actually as strong as a lot of Democrats had wanted. Essentially, last time we did a big bailout like this of the auto industry after the 2008, when we did that, the government acquired equity. So basically say we're giving these companies a lot of money. So as a result, we now own part of the companies. And so the United States for a long time, the federal government owned part of GM and Ford and Chrysler. Actually, GM and Chrysler, not Ford. And we basically, once those companies paid off the government, then we went away. But in this case, we're not getting any equity. So the federal government's not acquiring equity. You're not going to own it. There's no chance we're going to make a profit off of these loans, as we did off of the auto bailout in 2008. So that was controversial. And the other part of it that's controversial is the idea that the Democrats wanted a provision saying the companies could not fire anybody. So you had to keep 9% of workers on payroll. If we're going to give you this money so you can keep going, well, then you can't fire people. Otherwise, what are you doing with the money? You're just pocketing it. And Republicans were able to win provisions to relax that and say, well, you have to try and not fire anybody. So you have to make an attempt to not fire anyone. Which honestly is not much of a provision, right? Who's going to say, no, we didn't have to fire him, but fuck it, we just did it. So it doesn't seem like that's actually a very useful provision, but it is in there that they're at least supposed to try not to fire people. In addition to this $500 billion slush fund, there's also a lot of stuff going to specific industries. So we have $117 billion going to hospitals and $30 billion going to airlines. $30 billion for airlines is a lot. And again, it's been controversial about whether we should give airlines anything, even though airlines aren't actually making much money right now, because you have to be insane to fly anywhere. Even though airlines aren't making much money, airlines are actually a phenomenally profitable business. There's nothing wrong with the airline business in general. And over the course of the last 10 years, airlines have started making a lot of money off of things like charging for bags. And so those airlines have been enormously profitable. They've profited, the profits of the airline industry over the last 10 years are somewhere around $100 billion. So they've had $100 billion coming in. And rather than use that money to try and build up reserves or try and solve some of the long-term problems airlines have had, especially with regard to labor. So basically, they still have problems with how much they're supposed to pay their pilots and their stewardesses and all that. So rather than fix those problems, they've actually gone to stock buybacks. I mean, they've basically been taking the $100 billion and putting it into their own stock, buying the stock up to drive up the stock price. Basically, if you buy up shares of your own company, there's now fewer shares in the market, so there's a smaller supply, same demand, so the price goes up. They want to drive up the price of their shares because it makes their shareholders money, but also because a lot of CEOs get paid based on what the share price is. So they have an incentive to take that money and spend it basically to make their shareholders and the CEO richer rather than to solve the problems. So the idea that they need $30 billion right now because they're going out of business when they've had $100 billion coming in that they just kind of frittered away trying to make themselves richer, that did rub a lot of people the wrong way. And I think that's why airlines asked for $50 billion, which is actually more than all the airlines in America are currently worth, but only got $30 billion. All right, last couple provisions. There is a provision for small business aid through the Small Business Administration, where small businesses will be able to apply for immediate loans of up to $10,000 and then longer-term loans to try and keep people on payroll. That's important because a lot of small businesses like restaurants or retail establishments are going out of business, and this is an emergency lifeline for them. And mortgage forbearance. So almost all, just like student loans are mostly underwritten by the federal government, mortgages are mostly underwritten by the federal government. So as a result, we've got mortgage forbearance where basically, again, if you've got a mortgage, you're able to call up your lender now and say, hey, because of COVID-19, I can't make my payments. And you're in forbearance, meaning you don't have to pay. The debt isn't going to go away, but you don't have to pay right now. And you can space it for up to, I think, 6 months in the current version of the bill without having to pay your mortgage. So it's 60 days initially, and then you can extend it for another 30 days up to 4 more times. So that's important, right? So you're not going to lose your house right now in the middle of the pandemic. You can delay those payments forward. It's not clear how much that's going to help because even though it helps in the immediate term, you don't have to make your mortgage payment this month. It doesn't help in the long term because you're still going to have to make the mortgage payment eventually. And if your company doesn't come back, it's not going to work, and you're still missing that income. So unless something happens where you get a lot of money in later, it's not clear how you're actually going to be able to make that payment. It also includes eviction protection, where basically no one is allowed to evict people right now. Now, this actually doesn't do a lot to help people who owe rent, right? So we're talking about mortgage-backed securities because that's what the federal government regulates. Because the federal government owns a lot of those mortgages. But we're not getting, the federal government can't really help or is choosing not to help with eviction. So if you rent and you can't make your mortgage, you can't make your rent payment, their landlord in theory can still evict you. Although a lot of states like New Jersey and New York are saying no one's allowed to evict anybody right now. We don't care why. So those are the big parts of the bill. The bill is, as noted in the podcast, the largest bailout bill ever attempted, like a little over $2 trillion. And it's also widely agreed that it's not nearly enough. So the idea that you're going to pay Americans $1,200 once, and that's going to get them through this, I don't know about you guys, but that doesn't even come close to my mortgage payment, well, when I had a mortgage payment. So that's not considered to be enough money. We're pretty sure that they're going to have to do more later. But this is not a terrible bill, right? The fact they got the oversight into the large business bill is really important. The fact they did build some of those strings in there, try and stop people being laid off, and they got gig economies in there. Democrats got a lot of what they wanted out of this bill. Not everything they wanted, and certainly a lot of people are unhappy with it. But it does show exactly how much Congress can do when it's in a crisis. The idea that Congress, a few months ago, Congress would have come together, passed a bipartisan $2 trillion stimulus bill is insane, right? Republicans have been against the debt and increasing the debt for years. Democrats really wouldn't want to do anything to help President Trump. But right now, things are bad enough that both sides are working together on this. The last thing I want to talk about is the historian who came on third in the final portion of the podcast, talked about how past political realignments came in times of crisis. So let's talk real quick what we mean by a realignment. So in general, we've got a two-party system in the United States, but who those two parties are and what they represent is up in the air and does shift. So, early on in the country, we had the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Then the Federalist Party went away, and we got another party rising up in their place. So over time, we've had this party system where it's always two parties, but who those parties are and what they represent does shift quite a bit over time. So the Democratic Party that arises in the 1830s under Andrew Jackson, even though we still have a Democratic Party, it's not the same Democratic Party we had under Andrew Jackson because we've had a number of realignments since then. So we had the Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson, and they fought against the Whigs. Then the Whig Party went away in the 1850s, and we got the Republican Party. So we had Republicans versus Democrats. But the Democratic Party shifted and became the party of Southern rights and resistance to civil rights. And then 1930s, they shift again. We have another realignment, and the Democrats now become the party of the New Deal and FDR. And we get another realignment in late 1960s, where the Democratic Party becomes the party of civil rights and of northern urban areas, and the Republican Party becomes the party of the South. So even though the Republican Party today is the same, in theory, the same Republican Party in 1968, the people they represent are completely different, and their issue views are completely different. Really, the only thing the same about the Democratic Republican Party before 1968 is the name of the party. Everything else has changed almost completely. In some cases, almost flipped. So realignments tend to happen most, these where the parties are actually shifting. These tend to happen most in times of crisis. So in the 1850s, we get a crisis over slavery, where the consensus over slavery from the 1830s until the 1850s had been, let's just not talk about it, and maybe it'll go away, it won't cause any problems. And when it becomes clear in the 1850s that's no longer viable, that we're essentially having a civil war in Kansas over slavery, that's the point where the Whig Party, who is devoted to not talking about slavery, collapses. And so because they get that collapse, then we get new parties arising, and the parties' meaning changes. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party both mean different things after that than they did before. The Republican Party rises at the ashes of the Whig Party. So again, the 1930s, Great Depression causes a crisis, and the parties fundamentally shift, right? FDR changes the Democratic Party in the 1930s. In 1968, right? So you've got civil disorder, riots in the streets, urban cities, on fire in Newark, just near here, where we are here, and at the same time, got the Vietnam War. So we've got all these crises, and that leads to realignment. So the argument that's being made in the podcast is that past political realms, big shifts in the way we understand the way our country is supposed to work, have happened largely at times of crisis. And so that this might be an opportunity for a new crisis, for a new realignment. We're actually very overdue for realignment. Realignments in American politics typically happen every 30 to 40 years. And the last one that's agreed upon, we all agree was a realignment, was in 1968. So we're well overdue. And you had a lot of people saying they thought 2008 with the election of Barack Obama was a start of realignment. Possible, not close, it's too soon to really be sure at this point. So we've got realignments going on. We're waiting for realignment, and the argument is we could get a realignment. That is where the politics and the coalitions behind the parties we have fundamentally shift. What does that look like? At this point, it looks like the Democratic Party moving much more to the left, embracing things like single-payer healthcare, embracing things like more restrictions on large corporations, and the Republican Party becoming, as is Donald Trump, very much a ethno-nationalist party, saying should be a country for Americans, especially for white Americans, and we need to preserve our culture and preserve our borders. So it looks like we could be moving into that realignment, and those are linked with crises, which means that American politics in general, the way we understand politics in the world of government, could very much be up in the air right now. All right. That's almost a half hour, so I think that's enough for us right now. If you've got any more questions, stuff you want me to address on this, you can throw it over in the Discord. If not, thank you very much, and I'll talk to you again soon.